In February 2016, Anita Johnson met a woman in Milwaukee fretting that, although she had voted faithfully for decades, she would be unable to cast a ballot in the presidential election. Her Wisconsin driver's license was about to expire, and since she was 90 and no longer drove, she wouldn't renew it. But she had heard about the state's strict new voter ID law, requiring official photo identification. Without a license, she worried she was out of luck. "Maybe not," said Ms. Johnson. The state coordinator for Vote Riders, a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that helps citizens vote, Ms. Johnson pointed out that the State Department of Motor Vehicles could issue a photo ID. Poll workers would accept that as proof of identity. On the very last day the would-be voter had a valid license, Ms. Johnson drove her to the agency, which issued the necessary state card. So did she get to vote for president, at 91? She did, Ms. Johnson said. "I know, because I drove her to the polls." Older people vote in last year's presidential election, Census Bureau data show. About 64% of all adults had registered to vote and 56% reported voting. But among those aged 65 to 74 years old, more than three-quarters had registered and 70% voted, a proportion that dropped only slightly in older cohorts. Even among people aged 85 and older, more than 60% cast ballots. Still, we don't make it easy for them. Physical barriers at polling places, a longtime obstacle for the elderly and disabled citizens of any age, can prevent older voters' participation. Voting machines may not accommodate people who use wheelchairs or are visually impaired. The Government Accountability Office last month reported the results of a survey of 178 polling places used in 2016. Accessibility had improved since 2000, the GAO concluded, but the great majority still had impediments outside, like steep ramps or inadequate parking, or inside that could discourage or exclude disabled voters. Federal law requires accessibility, but there's very little enforcement and resources devoted to ensuring that older Americans and others with disabilities can vote, said Wendy Weiser of the Brennan Center for Justice at New York University. More recently, a wave of onerous state voting requirements has added to the problem, with an outsized effect on older voters, argues a new report by Senator Robert Casey, Democrat of Pennsylvania, and Senator Amy Klobuchar, Democrat of Minnesota. Officials in states adopting the requirements usually cite fears of widespread fraud, a concern debunked by researchers and election officials themselves. Nevertheless, older people who'd voted religiously all their adult lives are suddenly encountering barriers that effectively disenfranchise them. Needing a photo ID, getting a photo ID, getting access to polling places. There are lots of obstacles for older people, said Mr. Casey, the ranking member of the Senate Special Committee on Aging. As voting requirements tighten, the target may have been younger voters, poor voters, minorities, said Richard Hassan, a specialist in election law at the University of California, Irvine. But one of the casualties has been older voters.